Hi again, everybody. This is chapter 14. We're getting very close to the end of our study of the life course, and this week we're looking at the period in between childhood and adulthood, referred to as adolescence or the teenage years. Mostly adolescence is associated with the teenage years. There are other views of this time period, and I believe actually this author actually extends adolescence to 22 years of age. There are other theories, and we'll be talking about this again in the next chapter, covering the next chapter. But there's a theory called emerging adulthood, or I think Hutchison refers to it as young adulthood here, which is this period of time that's more recently been added between adolescence and mature adulthood, let's say. But more on that later. This text really doesn't give that particular stage much of attention. There's a mention of it in the next chapter, but that's about it. But so whether you look at adolescence as ending at somewhere in early college years or after graduation from college, or however you want to see it, this is the period we're looking at this week. And I will add that with the exception of maybe being responsible for finding placements for difficult teenagers who really aren't happy, and who have very disrupted lives and are just very difficult to be able to accommodate. This period of time in my professional career has probably been the one period of life that I find the most interesting to work with people during. That's forgive my syntax there, but I just have always enjoyed working with adolescents, and I just find involvement in that stage of life with them is something that's always been very invigorating to me. And as they kind of discover themselves and their own identity, it's a great to be a part of something like that. But adolescence is something that actually it's a social invention. It's a part of our social construction of how we see the world. The idea that young people take a decade to grow up, in the meantime inhabiting some space between childhood and adulthood, or between adolescence and adulthood, is that's the young adulthood or emerging adulthood that I was telling you about. That's rather new in this culture. But a bit older is this idea of adolescence, which was created when G. Stanley Hall wrote his big 2-volume study of adolescence. And the idea that developed from this is that there's a stage between childhood and young adulthood that's characterized by immature behavior and capriciousness. That's what we now call adolescence, or the teenage years. Now, Hall saw adolescence as being a period of what he referred to as storm and stress, or I think actually the term he used was the German Sturm und Drang. But a lot of experts today agree that it doesn't have to be that stressful of a period of time. But before any of these ideas were invented, and they were invented for economic and social reasons, because of employment needs in the days of the early 1900s, when more jobs had to be opened up for adults. And so one of the ways to do that was to get children out of the workforce. And so laws were implemented that, were supposedly designed to protect children from the abuses of the workplace, child labor laws, and also to improve their capacity to take care of their lives later on by compulsory education laws. All those things were established in the early 1900s, but really had a strong motivation behind them that was economic in nature. As is often the case in American culture, everything comes down to the dollar in the end, right? I mean, it's for why something happens. But in any event, with that period, those legal steps being taken, children are no longer expected to take on adult roles as soon as they were able, because previous to this time, they often spent their days apprenticing by their parents' side, or transitioning to adulthood as soon as they reached puberty. So this is really a great example of how age is a social construction. We'll talk about this later, but aging is the biological process, but age is the social correlate to aging. More on that later, however. Um, Nowadays, it seems like a lot of our experts and the professionals in the field really focus on adolescence as trouble. But as I said, there's also a lot about that, about interacting with them and having them in your life is really very invigorating and very rewarding to any of us. A lot of societies are very clear, as it points out here, to the kinds of things we want their teenagers to avoid, like drugs and alcohol, pregnancy, delinquency, but we're not so clear necessarily about what positive things we want of our youth. And so I think it's something of an indication of the fact that this stage is a social construction, and even 100 and some odd years later, we still haven't really figured out. I mean, we know what's going on during this phase, but we haven't given this stage a real purpose. So that's just something to consider. Why teenagers sometimes come into conflict with their parents and things like that is partly because of that, I think. A lot of societies, as this points out, uh, more primitive, kind of undeveloped societies have a rite of passage for adolescence that kind of marks the end of their childhood, and really it's not really a rite of passage into adolescence. It's a rite of passage into adulthood, I should say, and it marks the end of the young person's youth and indicates that they're now a fully grown human being, adult or whatever. Many societies send their boys off into the woods, for training in the ways of the warrior or whatever it might be. Sometimes they're matched up with their wives to be through some sort of arrangement or whatever, and they have a marriage ceremony at a very young age. All of these kinds of things very different in primitive cultures than they are in the more, and again, primitive is a judgmental word, but let's say undeveloped cultures, traditional cultures, um, much clearer, I think, for young people in those stages as to what has to be accomplished to become an adult, and much clearer as to when society actually accepts them to be an adult. And so these remain vague things, vague concepts, vague processes in more industrialized societies such as our own. And as a result of that, sometimes there can be a fair amount of conflict between parents and children, adults and young people, as young people believe they're prepared and ready to take on adult roles and engage in adult behaviors and things, whereas the adults in their lives say not quite yet. So what are the rites of passage in our society? Well, they're very, very vague. If they exist, they don't really exist formally at all. But I mean, some people kind of consider the driver's license that sign that adulthood is upon us. Some say high school graduation. More and more, as once again the economy demands that graduation that kind of signifies adulthood maybe now is graduation from a university program, even an advanced degree. There are studies that indicate that many young people continue to live seriously, continue to live with their parents into their early and mid 30s. Now, this is not the majority of young people, but it's still not an uncommon thing. So, when does youth end, and when is it necessary to be prepared to take on one's own life and to support oneself and everything is a question that's really very open in cultures. But one thing we know is that this period of time is characterized by profound changes, biological, psychological, social, and spiritual, and those are the things that we're going to be looking at in our talk this week. Here's a chart from the text on the adolescent and the development the adolescent goes through. Now you see that the period of adolescence is separated into three stages: early, middle, and late. And the human being is really quite different in each of those three stages. And so the idea that there is one period of time here is really, it's a misinformation if you think it's just one period, because the 11 or 12-year-old is very, very different from the 18 or 19-year-old. Here you see the author referring to late adolescence as extending into the 22 years of age, which is kind of associated with the graduation from university. But there's very different things going on biologically, psychologically, and socially, as you can see here. Biologically, of course, there's a lot of growth that goes on during this period of time, rapid physical growth in terms of height and weight and those kinds of things. A lot of focus placed upon sexual characteristics developing during this period of time, both primary and secondary um, sexual characteristics. This all begins with puberty, which actually, I think the text points out, actually begins before we know it and before we can see signs of it. Puberty is already underway in the child's system. But this is the period of the life course in which the reproductive system matures, and there are many other things that go on during this period of time that we refer to again as secondary sexual characteristics. But there's a lot of focus placed upon on the emergence of this human being sexuality during this period of time, both with the child or adolescent, him or herself, but also with the adults around that child. Sex hormones become very active during this period of time. There's, as pointed out here, the androgens mostly for males and the progestins and estrogens primarily for female. But both males and females have all three of those hormones, and obviously in varying degrees and varying activity levels in their systems. The puberty is oftentimes, or the start of adolescence, I guess, is for girls is often identified as the time of the first menstrual period, although she's not ready to, I think, to become pregnant at the time of the first menstruation. It follows a few months later, but this is often considered to be the sort of that passage into adolescence. Boys, again, they have it's a much vaguer event, and sperm mark is is the term that's used here when they ejaculate for the first time. But that's not something that boys may notice it, certainly, but it doesn't necessarily mean they don't go out and talk to other people about it like girls may go to their mothers or to other girls and talk about their first menstrual period. And so there's some question as to whether or not that's really the same thing or not. But that's the best we can do for marking the beginning of the passage into adolescence for boys. Biologically, brain development continues also. There once again, there's another period where there's overproduction of synapses. This is in the gray matter in the brain. This begins to occur just before puberty, and it tends to be followed by another round of pruning of those synapses. So, what goes on in that child's outside world and his or her interactions with the outside world has a lot to do with what happens in that brain. So, that does imply some of the concerns, for instance, that might be out there about kids with their video games and the kinds of things that they're interacting, the kinds of interactions they have with those video games and things like that. There may be some validity to those concerns. As what synapses are we seeing being fired over and over and over again? Particularly in the early adolescent years, and so that's just something to think about. I'm not one who places too much emphasis myself upon the influence of video games on otherwise stable adolescence, but nonetheless, this is a point that probably does deserve some attention. Is how those games and the nature of those games may impact the child's brain development. Likewise, I would also add here that the use of alcohol and marijuana, setting aside even the physical results of that at this stage because of the brain development and how it may inhibit brain growth or harm brain growth. When you consider that, the early use of, say, alcohol or marijuana in social relationships, most alcoholics would tell you that their own psychological development stops when they began drinking. The adolescent may become unable to really develop socially as well as they would if they weren't using. And again, how does that impact the parts of the brains that deals with interactions with others and those kinds of things. And again, in early adolescence, this is a particular period because of the growth and the pruning that goes on, I think, where we should be looking very carefully at those things. The frontal lobe really are key players in the development of those executive functions of planning and working memory and impulse control. And nowadays, brain people are saying that they're really not fully developed into the now maybe even into the mid 20s. Certainly at the during the period of early adolescence, you can expect the youth to have very limited capacity for these kinds of executive functions at this stage. They're still very much a child in that way. So the adolescent's ability to reason and problem solve will be different based upon age to a certain extent, and also depending upon the situation. And this text talks about cold cognition and hot cognition, that the teenager is better able to make good decisions when he or she is alone and calm, but in a situation where where emotions are running high, where there's a lot of peer pressure, that kind of thing, where they're feeling sexual tension, that kind of thing, decision making tends to be more impulsive in those hot cognition situations. So we can assume that the teenager, and again, the younger the teenager, the more true this is. They do not have the maturity or impulse control of an adult, and therefore really should be less autonomous, and they tend to be much more susceptible to peer pressure and understanding the consequences of their actions, or at least thinking about it ahead of time. And this is something we're always asking kids to consider, but understand that younger teenagers aren't so good at this for a reason. It has something to do with where their brain is. Nutrition, exercise, and sleep. The balance among all these things is very important during adolescence with all this growth going on. And to summarize, probably in one sentence, what the text is telling us is that American teenagers don't get the right nutrition, they don't get enough exercise, and they're sleep deprived. And so and this is not only true in America, but it's true in many parts of the world. And so, in the poorer parts of the world, the inadequate nutrition has more to do with the fact that they don't have the resources to access an adequate diet. But in developed nations such as our own, the issue is more that the kinds of things that kids are eating or that are given to kids in our fast food environment is inappropriate, and actually has been leading to an increase in obesity. I think we talk about this a little bit later on. This text tells us that less than half of the adolescents in a large survey that was done a few years ago engaged. Less than half of them had at least 60 minutes of daily activity, which is what is recommended. Less than half of them ate healthfully, and most of them were chronically sleep deprived. When I was in school, federal standards required physical education classes, and I think that's been removed now. I may be incorrect about that, but it's certainly not emphasized like it was at one time. And you know, quite frankly, I was, I was sort of a kind of more of an intellectual kid, and not necessarily a couch potato, but I really wasn't athletic or physically inclined so much. And if it wasn't for PE, I probably would have gotten through my teenagers a lot differently than I did. And so this is an area where we don't focus enough upon exercise and getting kids up and out and those kinds of things. That certainly the technology contributes to that issue. Now, one of the things that this points out, and you may have heard otherwise as well, is that in other places, is that the school schedule that is oftentimes out of sync with the adolescent circadian rhythms, because they change during this period of time. So the kids tend to be more alert at night and to wake later in the morning. And so if we have a teenager that's difficult getting out of bed, there may be some very real reasons for that don't have to do with him or her, not getting to bed on time. They may not be getting to bed on time for a reason, and their body just just isn't ready to get up and start getting active early in the morning like it may be at other stages of life. Some school systems have considered implementing later start times for school days for teenagers for this reason. Psychologically, all sorts of things going on. And first, just looking at the child's psychological reactions to the changes that are going on biologically. It's, puberty, of course, is a big deal, and the development of all those sexual characteristics. And it's really viewed differently from group to group. And in particular, the text points out that boys tend to view it more positively than girls do, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that the bodily changes, and girls generally reach puberty, I think, an average of 2 years ahead of boys these days, and the changes the girl's body goes on involves the addition of fat deposits in different parts of their bodies. This provokes a lot of problems for girls in their adolescent years because of increased weight, and many girls enter middle school on a diet, and I forget, I've seen other places where there have been statistics about the number of, or the percentage of girls who are in middle school who are dieting, and it's horrendous, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that because of how their body changes, reacts to puberty and things like that, and our focus upon thinness in Western culture as a sign of beauty sets up all sorts of issues about eating disorders, which we'll be touching on momentarily. Boys, on the other hand, their bodies react with the development of more muscle, which for them is a sign of masculinity, and they react more positively to that, I should say. Now, there's a lot of other things that go on in puberty where boys and girls may not necessarily react negatively to, or may react negatively to. For instance, the changes in complexion and skin and those kinds of things can really have a big impact upon an adolescent's self-image. Um, Also, by ethnicity, and African American adolescent girls tend to be more satisfied with their body image and less inclined to eating disorder than Caucasian American girls are. And in general, I have read that the African American culture is more appreciative of rounder curves and women and things, and not so focused upon this thin obsession that Caucasian society has. So this may be one reason for that. African American adolescents enter puberty earlier than Mexican American adolescents, who in turn enter puberty earlier than Caucasian Americans. Girls tend to reach puberty earlier than boys. And if you look at some of the studies about the impact of early development on boys and girls, girls have really suffer a lot more problems when they develop early, and because they develop earlier, because older boys see them as possible sexual partners, and their maturity wise, they just don't have the maturity to deal with that kind of pressure, and so younger girls sometimes can find themselves in much more difficult situations than younger boys do. Cognitively, there's a lot of development going on, and the text points out to three different big changes. One is improved reasoning skills, plus the development of the ability to think abstractly, to imagine things that aren't seen or experienced. So we're moving out of that concrete operation stage of Piaget, where we understand things in front of us, but now we can begin to think about things without it being there. And then that sense of metacognition, that ability to think about thinking, is all some of the things that occurred during this period of cognitive development. So this is Piaget's fourth stage, formal operations. And a lot of the studies now say that really formal operations needs to be separated into early and late, because again, the adolescent formal operation thinking in the early years is extremely different from the much more developed thinking of the older adolescent. And so some of this formal operations comes in bits and pieces. And if you've been around young teenagers, say, 12, 13, 14, sometimes they can be very hypercritical of their parents. And this is kind of a reflection of this early formal operation stage where they can imagine an ideal, let's say, of how their parents should be, and look at the reality of their parents and compare the two and think their parent doesn't measure up to the ideal, and yet they still have that concrete thinking where they don't see the gray areas and the bits and pieces of things that make their parents okay. So they're kind of using concrete thinking in some respects, and in the process of developing their formal operations, and this results sometimes in a young kid that's just very critical of parents and things. It's just kind of interesting when you think of it along those terms. So keep that in mind. Formal operations comes along in fits and starts, and in different ways with different kids. Teenager is better able now to mentalize. This is a new term to me, which is the ability to think about the mental states and intentions of others. This makes me think a lot of perspective taking, which of course increases even more in the adolescent years. The ability to put oneself into another person's shoes. I suppose this takes that a step further and says this is, putting oneself into another's body, let's say, or whatever, to really be able to think about how they perceive things, another person. Group identity is very important during this period of time as well, because the peer group continues to be very influential, much more so in the earlier stage than in the later stages of adolescence. But younger adolescents have this tendency to kind of lump people into in groups and out groups, and to evaluate those individuals accordingly. As youth become older, they have a better able to a stronger ability to be able to differentiate and to see things less concretely. Again, this is a part of that concrete thinking that younger adolescents still haven't quite moved out of. Well, we think of adolescence as being all about identity development, right? So, there's development of psychological identity, one's self definition as a distinct person, as an individual, separate from family, separate from parents, maybe kind of, kind of oddly connected to peers at the same time, almost, you know, uh, kind of contradicting the whole notion of being an individual. Kids individuate by being like everyone else their age. It's just sort of an interesting process where it's almost but not quite adult. And then the social identity. There's this part of that self concept that draws its identity from what groups the person belongs to, and how important those groups are. But identity development is complex. It's not just one thing. And and this is just a partial list of the kinds of identities, statuses rather, that our identities are based on. And you can kind of see that in some respects, the identities can maybe be very positive and not so positive in other areas, depending upon where one stands in this complex array of statuses that we refer to as intersectionality. So some of the theories about adolescence, and we're gonna develop a few, most of these, in the next few slides. But these are the ones that are pretty well known in terms of their philosophies and beliefs about adolescent development. I just love this little graphic about Erickson's 8 stages of man. It's one. It's not in the text. I found this elsewhere. This is you can see here that according to Erickson's theories, at least, and that the adolescent really is kind of in the middle of development, but moving ever closer to adulthood. This is the identity versus identity confusion status. I think the text well, in fact, the table we just left refers to it as identity versus identity diffusion. I have seen it referred to as identity and role confusion also. So any of these is probably fine. But the basic task is to establish this sense of who am I, answering that question. And Erickson had indicated at one point that the achievement of an identity required at minimum at least these three things, which is the achievement of a vocational direction, an ideological stance, which I have seen in other places is referred to as a religious viewpoint, let's say. And that doesn't mean attachment to a church, but it does mean some opinion or a stance about religion. But just call it ideology here. A vocational direction, ideological stance, and a sexual orientation. Now, Erickson, as we've mentioned earlier, these theories are criticized as being very tied to, actually probably white middle class Western values, and certainly there are variations on this, or there should be variations on this for a lot of the clients that we encounter that come from other cultures. He referred to the period of this fifth stage as the period of adolescence as one of a psychological moratorium where an individual can try on various roles and identities without making a commitment to any of them. So that's Erickson's view. Marcia has James Marsh, I believe it was, had a theory of the four statuses of identity, and this matrix isn't in the text, but I find this to be very helpful and clearer in terms of how you combine the notions of commitment and exploration to identify where a person is, so that you have, if you have a commitment and exploration present, then that's identity achievement. Whereas if you have a commitment to an identity but exploration is absent, you're not thinking about it anymore. You're not really, trying to change or to consider other things. That's a foreclosure of identity. You get the sense there's the moratorium where a commitment is absent and exploration is present, and that fits very well with Erickson's notion of psychological moratorium. So you get the idea. That's Marsh's four statuses of identity. Piaget's, this is the fourth stage of formal operations. That's the little purple line at the bottom here, and essentially starting at around the time we consider puberty to be likely to be occurring or being close at hand. And during this period of time, the capacity for abstract reasoning, the development of hypotheses and theories, and testing solutions, the ability to think about thinking. Again, that's one of these things that is a part of the development here, and abstract logic and reasoning becomes much more possible. Again, remember, early and late formal operations as well. Kohlberg's theory of moral development, moral reasoning, the adolescent is thought to be engaged in the era of post-conventional moral reasoning, where morality is based upon principles that transcend social rules. So it doesn't matter so much what society expects it is, or what society says. It is based upon one's own beliefs and own principles. The youth movement in terms of weapons and that kind of thing, and 2018 is a good example, I think, of post-conventional moral reasoning, and also the reaction to that by many adults perhaps puts some truth to what Kohlberg believes, which is that a lot of people never go beyond conventional morality. There's this morality based on social rules, So, and that's the sad thing. But again, I think we all can agree with that. But that even the concept of universal principles, I think, in fact, Kohlberg said that in Western society, in particular, that maybe even most adults never reach that stage. Most of us never reach that stage where morality is based on principles that transcend mutual benefit. I would think that perhaps the monks and very religious individuals and those kinds of things are very spiritual individuals, perhaps or exist in this stage of universal principles. Would be stage three, part B, I guess. But in any event, adolescence, it's the stage of or the level of social contract where morally right and legally right are not always the same. And again, emphasis here is that many people don't ever actually reach that stage. Some time is spent looking at gender identity. This is the gender identity is identified as the internalized understanding of one's gender. And as we've noted earlier, this begins earlier in childhood and is elaborated on and revised in adolescence. Gender identity in most cases develops in accordance with one's physical characteristics, but as we know, that's not always the case. And there really isn't a whole lot known about, what impacts adolescent gender identity development and what accounts for the differences, let's say. So, and there is a distinguishing of the terms associated with gender identity. Cisgender is a relatively new term in the lexicon, I believe, which refers to basically identity that conforms with physical characteristics, assigned gender, that kind of thing. And then transgender, transsexual, and transvestite are differentiated here as well. And in fact, the text also just mentioned the word trans as essentially referring to anybody who isn't cisgender. But I think that's kind of an overgeneralization. We look at cultural identity and how important ethnic origin can be for adolescents who belong to those minority groups. Not only do they have to develop, does a teenager have to develop a sense of self, that identity as a member of the mainstream society, but they also have to acknowledge, at least I think for good mental health, to acknowledge their membership in their ethnic group as well. And how this plays out from ethnic group to ethnic group changes. It varies a lot, rather, as to how important ethnic identity becomes. And I think it is true that by and large most ethnic youth adapt to that conflict by adapting a bicultural recognition. But Asian American, that kind of African American, those kinds of things. But oftentimes this is a source of conflict, and particularly as has been pointed out in other lectures, between the generations, sometimes those individuals, let's say the older generation that came here from another culture, are much more tied to the traditions and have a stronger sense of identity with their original culture than they may have with the mainstream culture where they have emigrated to. Whereas the younger people are probably more closely focused upon associating with the mainstream, and that has a lot to do with the peer pressure and the pressures of the institutions, like the educational institution that they interact with every day. So oftentimes parents have a stronger ethnic identity than their children do. But there, as this points out, there's some research that says that in a culture where multiculturalism is embraced, and the text refers to Canada as one of them, this is less of an issue, and doesn't the conflicts, intergenerational issues, oftentimes aren't as strong in multicultural environments. We in the United States think of ourselves as multicultural, but we really are much more focused upon assimilation of the culture rather than multiculturalism, although we may not admit it. Within the family, and with the family, there's a change in that the concept of a developing identity means that there's some separateness from the family. This process is referred to as individuation, and Part of this is, the teen kind of steps back from the values and beliefs and all those things he's been taught in the family or she's been taught in the family, and begins to pick and choose which ones he or she belongs to or believes in rather. And some of that's influenced by influential peers, for instance, who may come from different value backgrounds and such. And so this sometimes can be very difficult for parents when parents don't understand this as a healthy stage. In fact, I believe studies will show that those kids who step back and who individuate and separate themselves from parental values, more often than not, return as adults to those values they were given earlier in their lives. And it sometimes is very helpful for parents to hear that from us as we work with kids who really are kind of acting in ways that parents will tell you, I don't really know who this kid is anymore. Clearly, there has to be a renegotiation of roles in the family and in adolescence, and the kind of controls that parents have placed on kids in middle childhood and early childhood has to change and grow with the adolescent, with the child, and so they should be changing the amount of influence a parent expects to exert on the child. Should change with the development of the adolescent. The text points out that in a multi-generational context, where grandparents perhaps are close by, or even aunts and uncles and things like this, sometimes old conflicts between the parents and grandparents can get reignited. This is kind of a common thing to have kids sort of align with grandparents against the parents. You used to hear about that a lot, and that really does happen sometimes, and it can create some issues within family systems, certainly. It's also interesting, one of the texts that I taught a course in adolescence for several semesters at KPC, and one of the authors said, that there was a survey of parents and their stress level, and one of the things that was a common factor when stress levels were high was that there was a teenager in the home, and the author said that if there's a teenager there, there's going to be stress in the household. And again, other people disagree with that, but certainly the kinds of issues that are going on for some parents who have more control, or who are, say, more strongly wedded to a certain set of values or beliefs or whatever, are going to have a harder time dealing with this independence, this individuation process of adolescence. And I also read where, for instance, younger parents, when their children reach adolescence, are beginning to enter into midlife. And if you believe in the midlife crisis, which I presume we'll be talking about next week, then you have an adolescent going through their identity crisis in the home with an adult going through their own life stage crisis, which can create additional conflict. Whereas with older parents, presumably, they have worked through a lot of those midlife crisis issues and are then going to be better able to deal with these conflicts more calmly that the adolescent may bring to them. It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about how the stresses and strains of the generations coordinate or don't coordinate, and how that can impact the level of crisis. It also mentioned that, for instance, with the adult male father, let's say in his 40s or whatever, and his teenage son is bringing home a very attractive young female, and she looks at the father and keeps calling him sir, it can really send that guy, that middle-aged guy, into his own little identity issues, as he begins to have to reconcile himself with the fact that he's getting older now, and he's just not attractive to younger people anymore. It's just there's a lot of interesting dynamics that go on with the adolescent in the home. So you can understand why some people say that's just going to produce stress, no matter how solid the relationship is in the family. Families throughout adolescence, the text points out, is one thing is for sure is that families are a central source of support for adolescents. Some of them now may be better positioned to support the adolescent's preparation for adulthood because, well, for one thing, there's smaller families now, and so they can provide more attention to their teenagers, and they may have more financial resources because they have fewer children also. But nonetheless, the world and is the society in which we live now, really put teens in a position where their family situation is oftentimes much more diverse and fluid than it has been in the past. So there's a difference in these issues with families today as opposed to, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Peer influence is strongest in early adolescence, as I think we were talking about earlier. By the middle period of adolescence, the opposite sex friends are included in the peer group. By late adolescence, and it isn't mentioned here, but by late adolescence, oftentimes relationships are focused upon something of a romantic partner, where it's more of a, the group becomes less important, and that close relationship becomes more important. And that preparation, if you think about it, Ericksonian, perspective, then that relationship becomes the proving ground for the next stage of development, which involves intimacy. But anyway, it talks about cliques, and this is something that's kind of famously involved with young adolescents. These cliques that the in-group, strong in-group and out-group orientation we mentioned earlier. The clique is the in-group, of course, but by the middle of adolescence, the groups expand, the cliques become less important, groups get bigger, and oftentimes are more focused around interests rather than, I guess, identity, so to speak. And again, opposite sex or the other sex is often involved in those larger groups. But still, because a teenager's a teenager, being included or excluded from groups still has a pretty powerful effect on development and and identity, the kinds of things that kid may do or not do. And while as the text points out correctly, I believe that while peer influence might not be strong enough to undo the protective factors that exist in that adolescence life, if the youth is already at risk because of other factors such as poverty and broken home and those kinds of things, then the influence becomes that much stronger and can be a bigger factor. So for romance, nearly all 13 and 14-year-old teenagers report having some romantic fantasies, if not romantic involvement itself. The romance, those relationships begin to stretch out longer. They're very very short-lived in the earlier years. And I think we were talking about this a little bit last week, but once again, when we begin something new, we rely very heavily upon the book, to figure out how to do things. Whether it's, I think I used the idea of cooking a meal. Other people might be working on an engine or something like this, where eventually you can get under the hood and do whatever you want, and not left to look at a book. But for me, my IQ level might drop 50 points as soon as I lift the hood, and so I need that book next to me, right? But as I got more and more involved with the engine, or I got more and more involved with whatever dish I'm preparing, then I don't need it anymore, and I know how to experiment. Well, this is true for romance and gender relationships, let's say, in adolescence. And so, when boys and girls kind of break away from that, the opposite sex have cooties kind of stage, and they become interested and begin to experience some romantic and maybe even some early sexual feelings. The relationships tend to be based very much upon gender role stereotypes, and so boys are very, very male and girls are very, very female in a traditional sense, particularly in middle school when they interact with each other. And so when you see that, understand that as a part of the developmental process. And while maybe we want to correct those things, I think we do want to correct those things and begin that mentoring process, that space in between what they do and what they should be doing or can be doing. We're going to mentor them through this, but understand that this is a part of that thing about learning to be engaged in a romance, learning to be a male with a female or a female with a male, that kind of thing. And there's possibility for some real dangerous kinds of things, and I don't want to overemphasize that, but I mean, it's a possibility of some very negative things coming out of that reliance upon traditional gender roles, and so it's something that I think parents, and adults responsible for kids should keep an eye on all of this and intervene when necessary. But in any event, in the United States, this romance looks a lot different than it does in other cultures. Other cultures, there's arranged relationships and those kinds of things. As far as same-sex romantic relationships, there's been very, very little research on this. There's been many experts say that with both heterosexual and bisexual and homosexual adolescents, same-sex interactions in early adolescence is not at all uncommon, and it's. I think most people believe that it really should not be. The importance of it should not be, overemphasized. Let's say if it becomes evident to adults or whatever, kids, because of the fact that their sexuality is emerging and sexual urges and sexual curiosity, and remember again, initially in the early years, kids are hanging out with their same-sex peers more than they are with the opposite sex. And so when there is some experimentation regarding sexuality early in that period of time, because of the closeness to people in the same-sex sphere, there may be some same-sex sexual interactions and things like this that pass with time. And so, again, that's not at all uncommon. But setting that aside, obviously, we're recognizing that there are youth who begin to recognize their own sexual orientation at this stage, and there's not been a lot of study on same-sex relationships, probably because kids are very reluctant to talk about that thing, but what little research there is, it does indicate that youth are becoming more likely to act on their same-sex attractions, and society's just becoming more open, and so that has something to do with that. Finally, and that'll be the end of this part of the presentation about organizations and communities and institutions. We talk a little bit about school, and that really school's aside from all the other things it does educationally, intellectually for the child, is a bit of a practice ground in many social areas where those peer relationships are developed and acted out, and and in addition to this, all these cultures, all these people from different walks of life, all those cultures intersect in a school setting. So sometimes there's a great opportunity for learning, but also the potential sometimes for some difficulties among kids. The broader community, the authors refer to kids in their increased volunteerism, and that oftentimes schools have service learning projects. Between 9 foreign exchange students and 3 of my own teenagers, all of whom had some sort of service learning requirement, and I, as a social worker on top of everything else, I never had any of my kids that really took it very seriously, and the schools really let them off with some pretty pathetic excuses for community involvement, but that's another story. The experts here say that volunteerism is increasing among youth, and perhaps that's true. I know certainly some youth do that. Social activism, we see that, but it's becoming more prominent through the media, where social activism actually can occur much more easily than in the past, but also youth are out there in person, engaged in trying to change the world around them. And also talks about the importance of mentoring relationships. And long ago, there were studies about these resilient kids. And what was, looking at the kinds of things in the kid's life that contributed to their resiliency. How did they pull through such terrible things in their lives and still wind up, positively oriented and directed as an adult? And this one study said that the one thing that was common through virtually all of those kids' all of those people that were studied was the presence of a significant adult outside the family, a significant adult relationship outside the family. That's your mentor. And mentoring, when you get an opportunity to do that with a younger person, it's just a wonderful thing to do. Now, I've noticed that big brothers and big sisters are being referred to as mentoring programs as opposed to big brothers and big sisters now, but that's certainly another way to get involved with youth. Work is can have some very good things, because it does give them an opportunity to interact socially with people of all different ages and again, all different walks of life. This is one of the first times that, aside from the family, that youth have a significant interaction with people of different age groups. And also gives them a chance for greater financial independence. But too much work, it will have a negative impact upon their development, and it detracts from all these kinds of things like school and sleep and peer relationships, family relationships, and so the recommendation is somewhere between 10 and 20 hours at maximum of work per week for school age kids. I used to tell my kids, I had kids, my kids wanted to get jobs in school, and I used to tell them, you'll have all your life to work, just concentrate on being a young person. But that may not be the best philosophy given the fact that there are opportunities here for further development that, they might not get otherwise. And finally, there's a little bit of touch about information technology and communication. And my youngest boy insisted when he was in eighth grade that he was the only kid in school that didn't have a cell phone. I think it was his sophomore year before I finally gave him a cell phone. I thought he'd drop over dead when I handed it to him. But his principal said he might have been right. His middle school principal said he might have been right. Again, this is something you have to, parents have to kind of judge for themselves, I guess, when their kid's ready and when they have access. We used to have this rule that when you come in the door, this was early on. When you come in the door, the cell phone goes on goes in the bowl by the front door and stays there. And of course, as the kid got older, that changed. And mind you, with my youngest, the texting became a big deal while he had his cell phone, and so. Then of course, the rules got changed some to reflect the changing times. But one thing I did insist upon was not taking the phone to bed at night and keeping computers out of bedrooms so that it didn't intrude in sleep and wasn't up, texting things. And of course, still that he managed to find ways to get around that. But there are both benefits and risks to adolescent development with this technology. I was surprised to hear on the news the other day that, or reading it somewhere, that most schools in the nation continue to have controls over the use of cell phones. Some schools, some states, I think, instruct schools not to allow cell phones in the school. If they're with the student, they need to be turned off. And I was surprised to hear that, because that certainly wasn't the philosophy in Soldana and Kenai areas. The educational people were saying, we can't control this, so we need to embrace this technology and find ways to put those smartphones to use. And that's probably the wisest philosophy. But in any event, there's still a lot of debate about how to manage that properly for kids. And it does need our attention and involvement. So that's it for the first part of this chapter. Tune in when you can for the second half. Thanks.